WGKA.
And now, America's #1 show on pop culture and politics. This is the Michael Medved Show.
And another great day in this greatest nation on God's green earth, where there is great debate throughout this great nation about American foreign policy, the recent UN resolution at the Security Council, where I must say that the behavior of the Obama administration has been far more constructive, far more balanced and sane than I would have expected. It's a guy who's the deputy ambassador of the United States to the United Nations named Alejandro Wolf. I know nothing about him, but he gave a fine speech, and a fine speech concerning the recent events in the Middle East, particularly the bloodshed surrounding the Israeli determination not to abandon a blockade of military supplies to a terrorist group in Gaza. 1-800-955-1776 is our phone number. It's my privilege to speak for a little while to the former chief of staff to the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. George Birnbaum was an American political consultant before he went over to Israel to work for Prime Minister Netanyahu back in the 1990s. He has a unique perspective on the Prime Minister and on the current events in the Middle East. Prime Minister Netanyahu has already been to visit some of the some seriously injured Israeli commandos who were part of this operation. Mr. Birnbaum, thanks very much for joining us.
My pleasure for joining you today, Michael.
Okay, in terms of what the American media are getting wrong about this story, there's lots of stuff that I think people are getting wrong about this story. I spoke before about the misuse of the term raid and the misuse of the term humanitarian supplies. Beyond those obvious kinds of loaded words, what would you say has been the biggest example of media malfeasance regarding what really happened in the seas off Gaza?
Well, I don't know that it's media malfeasance as so much as avoiding some of the very basic facts in this story. And one of the most telling facts of this whole thing is the fact that several of the boats in this flotilla were purchased and sponsored by an organization known as the Insani Yardim Vakfi, known as in English as the Humanitarian Relief Fund. Now, this is an organization that has ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. It's part of the umbrella organization, the Union of Good. This is an organization that even the Turks, when they raided their headquarters in Istanbul several years ago, found weapons, explosives, diagrams of IEDs, and plans for jihad in places like Afghanistan and Israel. They, in fact, were connected to the Millennium Bomber, Ahmed Rassam, who crossed the Canadian border into America with over 1,300 pounds of explosives headed for Los Angeles International Airport. And the French even testified in American court that this organization, the same organization that owned these boats, had funneled money to Ahmed Rassam. So the Israelis had to assume that there was a potential for this organization using this flotilla under, quite frankly, the decoy of people with the right interests in terms of the humanitarian activists on the boats to smuggle weapons into Gaza for the sole purpose of being used as for terrorist acts against Israeli citizens.
1-800-955-1776 is our phone number. There are hints today from the press spokesman for Prime Minister Netanyahu, Mark Regev, and who I'm sure you know, that Israel might consider loosening, though not abandoning, the blockade of Gaza. Isn't it a mistake to reward this trap, this attempted lynching, and it was that, of Israeli commandos, to reward that with even the prospect of loosening the blockade at this point?
You know, Israel is constantly caught in a difficult position, and the position is between doing what's in Israel's best interest and worldwide public opinion, which often comes down the side against Israel. I don't think Israel will ever do anything to weaken its security, meaning Israeli intelligence is one of the best in the world. If there's ever any indication or thought that some kind of smuggling operation of weapons is going into the Gaza Strip or into the West Bank, they will do everything they need to stop it. At the same time, Israel is very sensitive to the humanitarian needs in the Gaza Strip. They are not against the Palestinian people. And if I can remind your listeners, in 1999, this was a prime minister who sent C-130s, Israeli C-130s, to Kosovo, a Muslim country, to take Muslim refugees away from the genocide the Serbians were committing against the Muslims. So this is not a war against Muslim people or Islamic people. This is not a blockade against humanitarian goods going to these people. This is a matter of Israel's security. So whether or not they weaken the blockade, I don't think they'll do so in any way that jeopardizes Israel's security.
All right, I have a question that I want to put out there. For those people who want to join the international fatuous, it seems to me, international condemnation of Israel, what do you think it is that Israel wants to accomplish in Gaza? The Israelis will tell you what they want to accomplish is they want to stop the rocket attacks, and they would like to live at peace and quiet with their neighbors. They have no territorial designs on Gaza. That's why they vacated Gaza in 2005. So if you think that Israel is actually trying to commit genocide against the Palestinian people, or they have some other agenda other than simply living in peace with their neighbors, what is Israel's main aim? 1-800-955-1776 is our phone number. I'm speaking with George Birnbaum, who's former chief of staff to Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel. You were about to say.
Yeah, the main aim is to get Hamas out of the Gaza Strip. I mean, we have a situation now where the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank under Mahmoud Abbas is doing everything they can, quite frankly, to fight terrorism within the West Bank and stop the infiltration of terrorists into the West Bank and into Israel. I think Israel is closer than ever before than having productive talks with the Palestinians in the West Bank. Gaza is another story. This is a area of land run by an internationally recognized terrorist organization. I think Israel's simplest and quickest goal would be to see Hamas leave the Gaza Strip and find some way to live peacefully with both the Palestinians in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip.
You noticed the story that among the supporters, big supporters for this so-called flotilla of hope, it's actually a flotilla of hate, to Gaza, was Bill Ayers, the one-time friendly colleague, I won't even say friend, of President Obama, leader of the Weather Underground, and his wife, Bernadine Dorn?
Yes.
Yeah, which is appalling. And by the way, a whole collection of anti-American leftists who have signed on with this campaign, including Media Benjamin and the Code Pink people and the normal suspects who never saw anything about America that they didn't condemn. Do you believe that this anti-Americanism is a product of America's support for Israel?
You know, Israel's the small Satan, and America's the big Satan in the eyes of the radical Islamists. So I don't think Israel is the cause of these problems. And let's remember that when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait back in the early 90s, he wasn't doing it because Israel existed. He was going after Kuwaiti oil. In other words, there are problems in the Middle East that go well beyond Israel. It's a convenient red herring, if you will. It's a convenient way of dragging America into this. It's a convenient way of dragging Israel into it. But the fact of the matter is that these are people who just are completely against our way of life, freedom, the right to choose our way of life, whether it's here in the United States or in Israel or anywhere else in the world.
Let's go to Ron in Chicago. You're on the Medved Show with George Birnbaum.
Hello.
Hi.
Good to talk to you. I just wanted to say it seemed like the protests that came up kind of fast and seemed very well organized, so that I think they were anticipating this, that the shipment, was just the spearhead, and they had already had the protests planned. That they were
George Birnbaum?
to provoke an incident.
I will say to Ron's point that these are people who are very well organized. There's no doubt about it. And the fact is they knew there would be a provocation. I mean, this was a bitter pill, right? I mean, had the Israelis let the flotilla into Gaza, it would have been a victory for these activists. Had they sunk a ship, it would have been a victory. Had what happened, it's also a victory. So I think Ron is right in saying that there was an expected provocation, and they were probably expecting something maybe even worse than what happened. And they used the organization to immediately let loose with these demonstrations around the world.
Well, and again, the demonstrations in Turkey, for instance, were clearly government-sponsored and government-sanctioned. And that government can't do much often, but one thing they can do is turn demonstrators out in the street for a pro-government rally. We're speaking with George Birnbaum. He was a political consultant in the United States for conservative candidates, Republican candidates for office. He also served as chief of staff for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. He's speaking to us today about the current crisis in the Middle East. So President Obama spoke apparently 3 times today to Prime Minister Netanyahu. What do you think they said to each other? We'll find out from George Birnbaum, who certainly knows or could anticipate the Netanyahu side of those conversations. Mr. Birnbaum, you heard, I'm sure, that the Prime Minister spoke 3 times today to President Obama. How would you speculate, having worked closely with this world leader, Mr. Netanyahu, how would you speculate these conversations went?
My guess is they went fairly well. I think Mr. Netanyahu probably laid out in great detail the facts of what happened. Certainly he probably shared with the president certain intelligence reports they had before trying to stop the flotilla. Probably shared with him the fact that the Israeli government for the past week and a half had begged the flotilla not to try and run the blockade, but rather come to Ashdod, have the contents of the cargo checked, and if it was indeed simple humanitarian goods, that they would all be forwarded to Gaza. I think he just explained the facts. The facts of this case, and I welcome the UN resolution for an independent investigation, because I think the facts of this case will be very clear on Israel's side.
1-800-955-1776. The UN resolution today blamed neither Israel nor the Islamist protesters, who were shown on their own broadcast chanting Kedar, Kedar, invoking a Quranic description of a slaughter of Jews by the Prophet Muhammad. Let's go to Larry in Fair Lawn, New Jersey. Larry, you're on the Michael Medved Show with George Birnbaum.
Hi, good afternoon. My concern is that if Israel knew beforehand that this could be trouble, why did they send the soldiers on so seemingly unprepared?
It's a very good question, Larry. There were 6 ships in this flotilla. 5 were boarded the same way the 6th ship had been boarded. In those first 5, there was absolutely no incident whatsoever. In fact, in the Security Cabinet meeting that took place where they were deciding about this operation, actually it was the Forum of 7 meeting, not the Security Cabinet, they believed that the only people they would encounter on these boats would be peace activists. And the first soldiers who went down, who were armed simply with paint guns, believed that they would be encountering peace activists and could have a conversation and encourage them to stop the boats and bring them to the Ashdod port for inspection. And that, in fact, did happen in 5 of the 6 cases. The 6th boat, the one that was sponsored and owned by this terrorist organization, had a different outcome. I think in hindsight, you're probably right, Larry. This maybe could have been handled differently. Maybe they could have sent in the commandos better prepared, maybe a different set of armaments. But again, 5 of the 6 incursions went according to plan. So it's a tough thing to predict, and it's an easy thing to look back and say could have been done differently.
Right. Let's go to Will in Staten Island, New York. You're on the Michael Medved Show with George Birnbaum.
Hi, Mike. How you doing? I have a couple of quick comments. One is, if anybody believes that Israel had no reason to board those ships, I mean, they have to do a little investigation themselves. Secondly, in the state of Israel in foreign policies and the United States basically abandoning them, what do people expect Israel to do? I mean, they have to show some kind of force. Also, besides that, I think people should really, really investigate the true Islam for themselves before they start blaming Israelis and Americans for being anti-Arab or Muslim. Thank you, Mike.
We'll appreciate your comments. Let's go to George Birnbaum.
Well, I agree with everything he said. I couldn't have said it better myself. I think, I do think that Israel had every right to assume that just like in Gaza, these terrorists use civilians as decoys, whether it's for launching rockets or smuggling weapons or anything else. Given the nature of the sponsors of this flotilla, there was every reason to believe that there could be some kind of illegal contraband on these boats, and Israel did do what it had to do to protect its citizens.
And when you say illegal contraband, let's understand that under the laws of war, a state of war exists between Israel and Hamas. I mean, it's a state of war. They've launched, after all, 7,000 rocket attacks on Israeli soil, murdered Israeli civilians with those rocket attacks. There was another attempted incursion from Gaza today. Two Palestinian militants, would-be terrorists, stopped by the Israelis today. So a state of war exists. As part of a state of war, it is an acceptable tactic of war to initiate a blockade against your enemy. This is something that you can see in all the books of international law. And one of the things that you do in a blockade is it should not and cannot be a blockade of humanitarian supplies. But Israel has not blockaded humanitarian supplies. They have been coming in, I understand, at the rate of 100 trucks per day. Is that right?
I can't confirm the rate. You're probably right. I will say that, yes, I mean, it's not just a state of war. Even in a state of conflict, of armed conflict, the blockade is recognized by international maritime law. And the boarding of ships in international waters for the purpose of protecting that blockade is allowed. So this was not an act of piracy by international maritime law.
But by the way, let's remind people that in the Cuban Missile Crisis of October of 1962, President Kennedy initiated an American blockade of Russian ships bringing supplies to Cuba, with far less basis for that blockade, no?
Absolutely. And I will, even to your point, I don't even think people understand that what Israel allows into the Gaza Strip is not just flour and rice and water. In fact, they allow things like cement, metal pipes, rebar, things that could easily be turned into bunkers and missile launchers and everything else, but they're allowed into Gaza for the purpose of rebuilding infrastructure. So Israel goes beyond what even humanitarian aid would be considered. They are sending in materials that could be easily turned against Israel in an act of violence, if so desired.
Let's go to Dave in Chicago. You're on the Michael Medved Show with George Birnbaum.
Hey, how you doing? I would love to get your guest's opinion on why it seems that American Jews constantly, and I am not at all Jewish either culturally or religiously, but why do they support Democrats in America who seem to be so dismissive of Israel?
George Birnbaum.
I share your frustration. I don't have an answer for you. I think you find that the Jewish population in the United States, by and large, is a liberal population in their social beliefs, and to some degree that translates into their foreign policy beliefs. I don't have an answer for you. In any given election, 75 to 80% of the Jewish population in the United States votes for the Democrat president. That hasn't changed for decades. And there's nothing that appears will cause that to change.
It changed with Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan won more Jewish votes than Jimmy Carter did, partially because there was a third-party candidate, John Anderson, who also drew Jewish votes. But I will say, George Birnbaum, that people, there's a whole book on this subject called Why Are Jews Liberal by my friend Norman Podhoretz, and he basically suggests that liberalism has become an alternate religion for too many American Jews. I know that you have to run. I wish we could continue the conversation. We will continue the conversation with listeners. If you think that Israel handled this situation poorly, what should a state do facing the kind of threat that Israel faces? We will be right back with your answers.
Michael Medved Show.